Is Wagner actually going through with their threat to withdraw from Bakhmut? Just who is left to defend the city? And what does it mean for Ukraine's counteroffensive? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is May 28th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first let's take a look at the control map. And first and foremost, there is some level of change to the Bakhmut front lines. Again, it's not a huge change, but it is a sign that Russian forces have not yet stabilized fully their positions. To the south, you can see Russian forces being forced to withdraw through this section here. Again, realistically, there's probably not like a line of Russian trenches right here. What you're probably looking at instead is a field of fire that's being covered by this wooded areas here. So again, I'm like somewhat skeptical that this is actually a contested area. But these maps, aren't 100% accurate, and just the sign that there's continued progress by Ukrainian forces is itself, I think, a positive. What I think is also pretty significant and worth talking about is the volume of total attacks ongoing. As you can see, this is an unbelievably low volume of offensive work by Russia. Just 21 combat engagements across the entire front lines. You can see here they're also being very limited in their shelling. They are continuing to shell along this northern front, which is an interesting call. You can see some clustering around here, clustering around Bakhmut. But really, other than areas that Russian military command has deemed extremely, extremely important, Avdiivka, Marinka, there's almost no offensive work being done. And some of this, I think, is defensive offense, again, fixing type operations. I did want to take a second and talk about the fact that I've launched a newsletter, the Strategic Sitrep. You can sign up for free. The link is in the description, and it is basically a summary of the national security news that has dropped in the given week. Last week, we talked about Sudan's ceasefire, its tenuous ceasefire, and it provides, you can see, we give you a simple, no clickbait, no hyperbole, no fear-mongering, just the facts, and then we give you the so what, so you understand the context in the larger picture. We talked about the Russian Volunteer Corps incursion, their raid into the Belgorod region, and of course, the fall of Bakhmut to the Wagner Group. So if you're interested in getting just once a week the stories you need into your inbox, go to thestrategicsitrep.com/subscribe. The link is in the description. Okay. And when we talk about the UK's defense intelligence update, you can see that even the UK has assessed that Wagner Group has likely started to withdraw from Bakhmut. What does this mean exactly? Well, it means, one, that Prigozhin is finally at a point where it seems as though he's giving himself his own commands. He's actually pulling troops out, and it seems like the Russian Ministry of Defense is shoring them up with the far worse performing Donetsk People's Republic forces. This is a huge downgrade from Wagner, who, while they're made up of a lot of conscripts, that Wagner is combat effective. Their leadership gets jobs done. While they're very attritional in their strategies, they do have an offensive strategy that does produce effects on the battlefield. The DNR has no such track record. It's not clear that they are able to advance in any way in this conflict, that they have consistently taken casualties to no discernible battlefield effects. They are a defensive force, poorly trained and poorly equipped. So the fact that they are going to be taking up the front line in Bakhmut is very troubling. We also have reports that the 31st Brigade of the VDV, one of Russian military's elite forces, though calling any force at this point elite is probably a stretch, is likely moving off from the Satove-Kremina line to reinforce Bakhmut's flanks. And so it's worth noting, again, here's Kremina. Kremina Satove is this area here. I've been calling it Kremina Lyman because I feel like that's the actual axis that that Russia is likely trying to advance. But pulling a major unit off of this line is a significant move by Russia. Again, they're going to have to camp it out right here to avoid their flanks falling apart. And as we've talked about, this is the goal of this Bakhmut push. It's probably a phase 1 of the counteroffensive in which as many Russian reserve forces, and I mean this in a tactical sense, right? A tactical reserve is simply a unit that can be plugged in to holes or potential holes in your front line. It can be an elite unit. It can be a poorly trained unit. It can be any unit at all. In this case, it looks like it is the VDV, the Russians' 31st VDV. But pulling it off of this line, again, is going to leave this more poorly defended and even less capable of mounting offensive operations or even things like routine counterattacks. So a sign that that Russia is making harder and harder calls. UK, of course, talking about Ukrainian forces seizing 20 square kilometers as of last week in the flanks around Bakhmut. And the Wagner force is going to have to make sure it conducts its relief in place very carefully, since a failure could result in Ukraine being able to exploit these gaps. Now, I think Ukraine is very unlikely to actually try to launch any sort of offensive into Bakhmut city center itself, simply because cities are really slow slogs to fight. It's very challenging to fight in a city, and it's much easier, as Ukraine and Russia have found, to conduct flanking operations and force your enemy to withdraw from an urban area in lieu of fighting them outright. I think that's what you're more likely to see, and I think Russia knows this, and that's why it's moving the DNR into this area, simply because it has a pretty good sense, accurately, I believe, that Ukraine is unwilling to launch this like frontal assault into a fortified city. That's just a bad call, and instead it's that's why it's putting its elite forces into the flanks. So anyway, guys, that is basically all I had for you. Yeah, that's basically it. Thank you guys so much, as always. Thanks, of course, to our members of combatvetnews.com, our colonel tier members. Thank you guys so much, and our numerous lieutenant tier members. I really appreciate you, and I will see you guys in the next one.